Good morning and good afternoon. Welcome to the Collaborative Innovation and Entrepreneurship online conference. My name is Lori DeVito, and I'm the lead of the Collaborative Innovation and Entrepreneurship Professorship at the Amsterdam University of Applied Sciences. We are a group of scholars and teachers that investigate collaborative interorganizational relations in a broad sense, but today we're looking at multi-stakeholder collaborations for grand challenges. We have a multi-year project that's funded by the Dutch Research Council, and also we're partnering with the Maastricht School of Management in this project. And this conference is part of that larger project, looking at orchestration of multi-stakeholder collaborations. Our aim is to bring together a group of scholars and practitioners so that we can discuss this field and progress it into becoming more effective orchestration for multi-stakeholder collaborations. I'd like to introduce our co-host, Huub Mutter. He's assistant professor at the Maastricht School of Management.
Thank you, Laurie, for your opening. It's my pleasure that MSM, together with the Amsterdam University of Applied Science, is organizing this academic conference on orchestrating multi-stakeholder collaborations for grand challenges. MSM already exists some 70 years and focuses on management, on leadership, organizational and institutional development, and indeed on innovation and entrepreneurship. MSM has a global footprint, so I'm really happy to see people from all over the world logging in this morning already, for us this morning in Maastricht. A global footprint with its focus on emerging economies. MSM's Expert Center on Emerging Economies contributes to stimulating sustainable local economic development, working indeed on global challenges, on grand challenges of equity, inclusivity, sustainability, food security. In this context, we as MSM promote multi-stakeholder partnerships, triple helix constructs, regional innovation networks in a role as researcher, advisor, educator, and yes, orchestrator. My recent research in Ethiopia found that multi-stakeholder partnering indeed leads to social learning and helps to open new doors for the people involved. On behalf of MSM, I wish you that new doors will be opened for you today. Wish you an inspiring, mind-provoking conference. Thank you, Laurie.
Thank you. So indeed, the combined strengths of Maastricht School of Management and Amsterdam University of Applied Sciences has attracted scholars and practitioners from around the world. And we're so thrilled to be able to welcome you to this conference today. There's also a map. You can see a bit of the footprint of where everybody is joining from. And you see that it's from all corners of the world, from India to Peru, Australia to Canada. So we're really, really proud to have everybody here and join in this discussion today. We have a really exciting program for you today. It's built up of 4 blocks. So we have the opening keynote, and we have 2 parallel paper sessions, and we have a plenary panel discussion later this afternoon. There's one Zoom link for the entire conference, so you can leave and log in with that same Zoom link. And that's been sent in email, but you can also find it in the conf tool, where you'll also be able to see, of course, the program and also the abstracts for the parallel sessions. We encourage you throughout the day, throughout the discussions and throughout the presentations, to put your comments and your questions in the chat box. We'll be monitoring that all day long and feeding the questions through to the presenters. We ask you also to stay muted, and we also alert you that we're recording. And so if you do not want to be on the recording, you can, of course, keep your cameras off. But it's also useful to know that the only thing that's recording are the presenters and the shared screen. So now I'd like to introduce my colleague, Jacomijn van Wijk, Associate Professor at the Maastricht School of Management and the Amsterdam University of Applied Sciences.
Well, I'm very honored and thrilled to introduce Charlene Zietsma, professor at Penn State University. Her work has been at the forefront of studying and understanding agency in response to sustainability challenges and grant challenges, and how this agentic behavior might result in institutional change in organizations and organizational fields, whether it's agency from activists, from incumbents, from NGOs, from smallholder producers, or housewives. During my PhD, we worked together to understand how activists in sustainable tourism pushed for change in the Dutch tour operating industry. And we looked at the role of multi-stakeholder platform for sustainable tourism. So I'm really pleased that we can continue this conversation on partnerships today, here in Maastricht, but also online. After Charlene's keynote, there is some time for questioning, but I invite you to share your thoughts and ideas in the chat during her presentation as well. So I guess, Charlene, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Jacomijn, and thank you, Lori, and others for inviting me to the conference. I'm really pleased to be here. We had a great day yesterday with the early career researchers, and we're going to have great paper sessions throughout the day and a terrific panel this afternoon. So I'm really looking forward to the rest of the conference as well, and very happy to be here. So I'm going to talk to you today about partnerships, performance, power, and potential. And let me just grab my thing here. So I'm going to first talk about partnerships as sites of negotiation across divergent logics. And I'm going to talk about performance. Do partnerships work? And for whom do they actually work? I'm going to talk about power and potential. How can they work better? What are the role of orchestrators and distributed networks? And then I'm going to follow up and say, what can we as academics do? So partnerships are different groups coming together to govern action and solve problems associated with common pool resources and externalities. For businesses, they create coordination benefits. They allow different businesses to share best practices around typically sustainability or social justice kinds of concerns, and they surface and manage diverse interests. They also level the playing field for competitors. And actually, that's kind of an issue, as a New York Times article a couple of weeks ago suggested. They might level the playing field too much, and it might be seen as collusion. But they also allow firms to maintain stability in their exchange fields. So what do I mean by exchange fields? Exchange fields, as we've written about, are the typical organizational fields that you see when you think about the institutional theory, DiMaggio and Powell, et cetera, where you've got a group of organizations that are in the same general area of organizational life, and they have a common set of suppliers and customers and regulators and deal with the same kinds of actors. It's a predictable and stable area. Typically, exchange fields like this, where these firms are dealing with each other regularly, it's underpinned by a neoliberal ideology. Power is determined by market position. Often they're resource extracting in some way with the idea on value capture, and they define that value capture in terms of dollars. An issue field, on the other hand, as Andy Hoffman originally identified in 1999, includes a much larger range of stakeholders, the people that are interested in a particular issue that may not be part of the exchange field. So it is, as a result, more unpredictable and more dynamic because there really isn't a shared logic happening within issue fields. Typically, people have different values and different perspectives, and as a result, you don't have that commonality. Power is tempered in these fields by legitimacy, resonance with the outside. So if you are an ENGO or First Nations representative, Canada's Indigenous people, then if you can get enough legitimacy and resonance with the public or with different other stakeholders in the field, you might in fact be able to affect what's going on in the field. You might have some power. So if we think about partnerships, we take that exchange or that issue field, which might be quite contentious, and we make it work together. We take all of the different actors, we have them together, trying to negotiate across these different logics and values and positions. So hopefully we see some positive action. We might see contention within the partnership, but typically they're working together to accomplish some objective. So do partnerships work? Partnerships, we want to think, do they work? Are they leading the way towards sustainability and social justice? I think there are some wins and some partial wins. We studied, for example, Grace Fan and I, water governance in the Okanagan Valley in British Columbia, and found that across a broad range of stakeholders, including farmers and First Nations peoples and miners and foresters and developers, a whole range of people, that emotional processes allowed them to actually develop an integrative governance model. So they were able to listen to each other and like each other and respect each other enough that they were able to find a way to integrate their interests. Jacqueline mentioned how we had studied the Dutch outbound tourism sector and looked at activists for sustainable tourism, and we saw again that this is at least a partial win, because they were able to negotiate a set of standards that then could be used by all of the different firms in the industry, and then work towards improving sustainability. But on the other hand, those standards weren't groundbreaking, and they just moved towards sustainability. So the trade-off, you can have lots and lots of members and make a lot of impact because you've got those members, or you can have strong standards and fewer members and make a bigger impact, but across fewer companies. One other win I'll talk to you about is CARE, which is a Canadian NGO, and the dairy industry in Bangladesh. I studied this with Kevin McCaig and Christine Oliver, and we looked at CARE coming in and working with smallholder farmers who had cattle, but they were producing milk that was of pretty low quality, and Bangladesh was in fact importing milk into the market, even though they had all this milk that was effectively going down the drain. So what was the problem? They didn't have good feed, they weren't treating the health of their cattle, and the market, then the milk processors weren't paying very much money for the milk. And so CARE came in and started to create partnerships among groups of farmers so that they could together adopt new standards of care and increase the quality of their milk. They brokered relationships across different feed suppliers and medicine suppliers in order to get them to provide the supplies that these smallholder farmers needed, and they negotiated with the milk processors in order to get them to pay more for higher quality milk, which they enabled by providing them with testers so they could test the quality of the milk. So what worked well about this partnership is the idea of contextual bridging. So they went in, they really understood the context, and they worked with local staff, village elites, and understood the norms in the context, worked with local actors in order to make this all happen. If you don't work with local actors, you might not have something that sticks. And so they were able to socially embed and materially embed these changes into the market. And we saw the market for dairy go up and farmers' incomes go up as well. So We can see there are some wins with partnerships and a whole range of them. I'm sure you can give me examples from your own research that show a lot of wins as well. But we also see that there are some not so good or not so positive interventions. Jacqueline van Wyk and her colleagues studied an intervention in the Ethiopian dairy market that had similar characteristics to the one we studied in Bangladesh, but the intervention didn't last because it didn't fit with government priorities, and the NGO, the orchestrator in this case, was not working directly with the most powerful actors. And so as soon as the NGO left the environment, things went back to the way they went. So you want to think, do I work with the most powerful actors? Do I build up the power of the people that are in marginalized positions? And you may want to think about how can you do both. We also have a series of unintended consequences and some outright failures, of course. Shell in Nigeria really did the partnership, the negotiation to get in there, but ignored some of the local actors, some of the indigenous people in the context, and then there were protests and the Ogoni 9 were killed. We see with the Keystone pipeline, a partnership again set up to negotiate how this pipeline would be put together, but still indigenous people were really upset with how it was going to go in. They protested. There was violence. And then, of course, the Rana Plaza disaster, very famous disaster that killed more than 1,000 people, garment workers in Bangladesh. And that is in a sector where there have been a lot of different partnerships in the past to take care of workers, and clearly not having the impact that it should have had. I could go a little bit further even, because after the Rana Plaza disaster, the Accord and the Alliance were negotiated, partnership agreements that were supposed to manage workers' rights as well. But we had COVID-19 happen, and the big brands canceled the orders for Bangladeshi garment manufacturers. They would not pay for the work in process inventory that they ordered. They would not pay for the fabric that they'd ordered. Workers were starving, factories were losing everything, and brands were protecting only themselves in this COVID disaster. So in one of the most partnered sectors in the world, where were the Accord and the Alliance members, the NGOs, to help deal with this disaster? I'll come back to that example later, but we want to think, we've got global partnerships, we've got global players involved, but despite these partnerships, we often have local disasters. And part of that is because global firms have the power. And typically we see NGOs and governments coming into these agreements, and they are working with those global firms, currying their favor and adopting market logics to fit with those firms. So there's short-termism, there are market mechanisms only, they tend to reinforce the power of the transnational firms that are involved, and they tend not to take care of local issues. They tend not to think about the relationships of the people in the places that are being affected. And NGOs are actually competing with each other as well for the right to be in these partnerships, for the funding for these partnerships, etc. So indigenous and local actors with more place-based and relational ideologies often have little voice in these partnerships and often bear the costs. An example, the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil. It was meant to be a terrific way to increase the use of sustainable palm oil in the world, but it had a whole bunch of negative effects: deforestation, destruction of habitat, there was slavery involved, there was child labor. Very problematic. And Reineke and Ansari talk about a fair trade negotiation. The partnership came up with a price that was below the cost of production for small farms. And this tends to happen regularly, where these partnerships come in, they set up these standards, you have to pay to be involved in the standards, and the costs for smallholder farms are so, or small producers are so onerous that they cannot benefit from these partnerships. We sometimes end up with violence and bodies on the line, as Bobby Banerjee tells us, and Ernst and Fuentes as well. Nature, lives, and livelihoods are destroyed. So we also can look at the performance of standards within fields and have a sense of how these standards affect each other even. So private governance arrangements, typically settlements that are negotiated by partnerships, cross-sector partnerships, in order to get to some common set of standards. And Sean Buchanan and Dirk Matten and I have a forthcoming piece at Org Science where we're looking at the structure of settlements within fields and what are the effects of those. So if we take the one dominant settlement, so the field is pretty unified, you have one settlement that is everyone seems to belong to. Typically what happens with that is that you get lowest common denominator performance. And what we mean by that is that everyone performs to the minimum that the market will allow them to get away with. That tends to be the result of a unified field. So the market letting them get away with it, they might have protesters, they might have people calling their legitimacy to count, but unless there's enough of a legitimacy problem for the firms, they won't have to respond. They can say, hey, we have this settlement, we're working on it. In fragmented fields, on the other hand, where you have multiple coexisting settlements happening, so you might have a standard that's catering to leaders and another standard that's catering to laggards and a bunch of different standards available out there, what you tend to find is a race to the bottom. The reason is consumers can't tell with all the noise around standards what's good and what's bad. And so firms will go to the standard that's the easiest for them to perform typically, and other standards will start to make themselves easier in order to attract more firms. And finally, we've got the bifurcated fields where you have two standards, two competing settlements within a field. And we argue that there you get a race to the middle. So the two standards will start to be compared to each other in the market. Usually there's one that's a leader and one that's a bit of a laggard, and the laggard will be asked to perform at the level of the leader, and the leader will be pressured by firms to perform at the level of the laggard, and they kind of converge in the middle. So, are we getting really good outcomes from these partnerships, from these settlements that come out of these partnerships? I would say they're better than nothing. Right? We're at least getting action on these issues. And the wider adoption can lead to greater overall impact, and maybe it's a step in the right direction. But we're living in a quickly warming world and a world with a lot of inequality. And so is that good enough? And actually, you can argue that if there weren't partnerships, there might be regulation. We might have more of a push towards regulating some of the bad actors. So I'll tell you briefly about the Responsible Business Alliance. And this is a settlement that Veronica Villena and Denny Joya and I are studying together. And really, Responsible Business Alliance started in the electronics industry because the first tier suppliers of the big brands were saying, hey, you're asking us, IBM, you're asking us to do this. Apple, you're asking us to do something different. Hewlett-Packard, you're asking us to do something different. And it was very uncomfortable for those first-tier suppliers to meet all of those diverging demands and push them down to their second-tier and third-tier suppliers as well. And so they said, hey, let's get together and try to come up with a common set of standards so that we can all be on the same page. So that would allow them to say, hey, we're working on these issues so they can get some legitimacy out there in the market, but it also solves that coordination problem. But they face a lot of tensions. So they want to increase the membership. And so that means they have to give up a little on stringency and autonomy. So you think about what kind of impact are you getting as a result. And by increasing the membership, they started to go outside of electronics. They started working with Ford. They started working with Walmart and a range of other suppliers or brands and companies. And it adds a lot more complexity. But on the other hand, it gives them more power and really lowers coordination costs because a lot of those companies are dealing with the same suppliers as well. And then finally, the idea of equity. The decision making is happening at the table with the big brands and the first-tier suppliers. The costs are being borne by the second-tier and third-tier suppliers down the line. And so there's a tension around the equity there. What RBA has done, they have some pressure valves in place to keep the standards rather generic, and we'd argue that's like a lowest common denominator response. They tolerate spotty compliance, so they have different levels of the standard that different firms meet. And in addition, if somebody doesn't meet the standard, then they'll try to persuade them to meet the standard. There aren't particular penalties in place. And they slow down the process of standard change so they can get everybody on side. What it means is if somebody says, hey, we've got to be working on slavery in the supply chains, they say, great, let's set up a committee. And they have an extended period of time where they study the issue and come up with a standard and then put it out to the membership to vote on it. And it might take 5 years. In the meantime, they can say, yeah, we're working on slavery, but it slows it down enough that they can get people on the same page. And finally, for those third-tier suppliers way down in the supply chain, they provide education. They don't provide resources. Hopefully the brands are providing some resources, but they're usually not. And so there is some education to help those third-tier suppliers meet their demands. What we end up with as a result, I would argue, is slow, relatively inequitable, and often symbolic performance. So the hegemony of the market logic, I'll argue, is really no accident. And the reason I say this is there's a forthcoming paper in Organization Studies in our special issue on organizing sustainably by Rami Kaplan. And he studied the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. It's a by-invitation group of transnational firm CEOs. And their purpose is to make the market logic dominate in cross-sector and multi-stakeholder partnerships. And they've been operating for about 30 years, and they work in a whole range of different partnerships. And really, they push that idea of private governance out there. And again, you have to ask yourself, if we weren't focusing on private governance all the time, would we actually be thinking about finding a way to do transnational governance with actual government bodies or semi-governmental bodies in some way, where they firms might be held to account a little bit more. So then if we think about this as issues around the business interests and partnerships are usually getting their needs met through the partnership. How can partnerships work better for non-business interests? How can we make space for relational ideologies, for example, for people that value the land that they live on, the animals, their relationships with each other, their communities, these place-based issues, these connected issues, the human and the non-human focus, and the idea of where the present is connected to both the past and the future. And so we're not after those short-term results. We're thinking more long-term, and we're thinking about different ways of doing things so that we protect the future for our future generations. And really, when we think about this, the role of orchestrators and partnerships is actually pretty key. So Barbara Gray, Jill Purdy, and Shaz Ansari have a paper, 2022 paper, where they talk about the key issue of power differences in partnerships. And I know Barbara's going to talk about this afternoon in the panel, and so I'll just hit some highlights here. But the idea is to think about what are those power differences in partnerships and how can we deal with them. So if we think about the idea of minimal power differences among groups, and where there might be relatively low alignment in goals, that's a perfect opportunity to set up a partnership to collaborate and come up with a set of standards to meet the goals that may actually take you to that uncontested space. The issue gets more challenging when you start to get into areas where there are significant or substantial power differences. And if you have marginal actors that don't have much voice in the process or may not even have the reflexivity to see themselves as marginalized because they're really embedded in the system and in systemic power, they may be quiet. They may not be able to voice their perspective, or they may not even see that perspective. And so what Gray et al. Argue is that consciousness raising at this point is pretty important in order to have these marginalized actors, these low power actors, move themselves up so that they can actually contribute in partnerships. What's likely to happen if you raise this consciousness is that you'll get some contention. And then that's okay, because that contention is needed in order to get a partnership that will actually integrate everyone's interests. So what do orchestrators do? What we know that they do is they bundle information and share best practices while safeguarding private information. So it's really good for coordination. There can be some significant benefits if practices get diffused that are really helpful, and they connect those who could benefit from connecting. There are issues around competition and collusion. So do we see competition among orchestrators? Do we see competition among the organizations that are a part of the partnership? Do we see collusion? We also see the idea that orchestrators respond to the demands of funders. So I talked about the market logic and how that might be affecting people in the partnership. It might push to short-termism and only market mechanisms and ignore relational issues. And if you've got funders out there that are also having that market logic, and they're putting out calls for proposals for orchestrators, and people are responding to those, they're going to take on that market logic as well. So you want to think about who's funding the orchestrators, and then what are those orchestrators doing? Orchestrators can also surface the issues and kickstart member response. So that's a bit of a more positive role for orchestrators. They might be front runners, they might be leaders, they understand the issues better, and as a result, they're able to get members more interested in acting on particular issues. We could also think about what orchestrators could do, and probably many of them are doing it, but let's think about what might actually make partnerships better. So if we've got situations where the power is mostly equal, orchestrators can enable that collaboration that Gray et al. Talked about. They can make space for and legitimate different logics and ideologies. They can create emotional connections. When I was working in the BC forest sector, researching that area, there was a joint or an alliance between one of the major forest companies and First Nations and Greenpeace, and they worked together, and the forest company got criticized by other forest companies for making a backroom deal with Greenpeace. And the VP Environment who was involved said, hey, there's no deal here. The only deal is if I care about what you care about, you'll care about what I care about. So it's that idea of really understanding and listening to each other, having empathy about what's going on, that allows you to say, yeah, I accept you care about that, and I understand that if I want you to care about what I care about, I have to actually take your interests into account. Also, emotional connections in the case of the Dutch outbound sustainable tourism that Jacqueline van Wyk and I worked on together with others, obviously. And it was a case of mutual co-optation. So the trade association initially tried to co-opt the activists by bringing them in and collaborating with them and working together on the partnership. But over time, they developed social relations and they liked each other. And as a result, neither side pushed each other too hard. They found a good agreement. It wasn't groundbreaking. People didn't push each other too hard because of the social relations. You can also, orchestrators can also help to create emotional energy for action. So this goes back to a paper that Grace Fan and I did on the water governance logic in British Columbia and the Okanagan Valley. And here, again, we had a whole range of stakeholders involved, and they had very different values and interests. So for example, the development people said, well, we just put a price on water and that's fine. You know, people will pay for what they need and that's how we'll figure it out. And the First Nations people were scandalized. Water is sacred. How could you put a price on water? And farmers were like, you're going to decide whether or not we're able to produce food based on who can pay the most for water? I don't think so. And so these very different perspectives had to be dealt with. The orchestrator in this case was a volunteer from the community, came in, did a fabulous job actually getting people to share their interests and getting others to listen to them. So you weren't allowed to interrupt. You really had to understand the different interests. And over time, they went through everyone's interests, and people started to respect each other, people started to like each other, and people started to trust each other. They also all understood that they were after the same thing. How do we preserve water in the Okanagan Valley for the long term? And so morally, they knew they were working on the right thing. They had pride and satisfaction, those moral emotions, and they had the social emotions of trust, respect, and liking. And the iteration in those emotions led to emotional energy, which allowed them to be more open, more reflexive, allowed them to engage more, and allowed them to increase their commitment to the process. And together they negotiated a governance logic that they all agreed with, a consensus-based process. Now, they also had a little trust breach at one point, and it set them back. Lower social emotions, lower emotional energy, lower moral emotions, and as a result, it took time for them to build up that commitment, engagement, and openness again. Okay, so let's also think about what orchestrators could do in mostly unequal power situations. So Gray et al. Talk about raising consciousness and fostering contention. So you want to think about, Escobar talks about local place-based pluriversal organizing that imagines different futures as a means of raising people's consciousness that they don't have to take what the system is giving them right now. They can imagine different ways to live. And Escobar talks about this in terms of Cauca, an area in Chile where it was a sugarcane area, and there were a smaller percentage of the population making money, doing well off the sugarcane, and then there was a large indigenous and African originated or Black population that was really suffering. And the land was suffering, and the environment was awful. And so the marginalized actors in this case, or these ones that were not in power were able to get together and start thinking about different ways to organize. And they did what others have called prefigurative organizing, where they said, okay, if we want to live in a perfect world, we have to create it. What would it look like? They created their own university. They created their own civic institutions. They also asserted their autonomy and rights. So when a mining company came in without permission with a big bulldozer, they took the bulldozer and they said, yeah, we can use this for our civic projects. Thanks for the donation. And so you can think about this, this raising consciousness as a means to enable people in local environments to start to imagine their own solutions to problems and different ways of operating. So what we know is that emotions, power, and connections to local actors matter, but of course you need time and money to make that happen. It also assumes togethering and not othering. And I think what we see oftentimes in partnerships is that there's a togethering of global business elite and maybe some government people and maybe some global NGO elite, but there's othering of other people that are being affected by this, local actors, and as a result, their interests are not taken into account as much. One example of this is in going back to my BC forestry context. For the first decade of the conflict, First Nations and environmental NGOs had an alliance. They worked together on this. First Nations had some legal power, and Greenpeace supported them in asserting that legal power. And as a result, Greenpeace and the other NGOs, and as a result, that alliance worked well for them. But at some point, it didn't anymore. And the First Nations got dumped, and Greenpeace worked off with its own agenda. And so it happens, right? They each have to think of their overarching agenda, and if they don't match anymore, the local interests can get dumped. So we talked about what could orchestrators do in low power or power different situations and in power equal situations, but we have to consider also what will orchestrators do. And that really depends a lot on who the orchestrators are. How do they get their authority? How could they help to enable consciousness raising and contention? Will they? And if they do, how will the powerful respond? Remember the NGO that was influencing the Ethiopian dairy market had this consciousness raising and contention aspect in mind as they were trying to get these local actors, the lower power actors in the context to lift them up. But because they didn't deal with the powerful actors in the context, that didn't last. So we also, we can think about place-based issues. We also have to think about balancing the local with systems thinking and longer term kinds of thinking. And so the argument is that distributed networks might be ways to handle that. So we can think about this with respect to global commons. So panarchical systems, Howard Grenville and Lanneman suggest, have interacting effects at different spatial and temporal scales. If we only focus on Cauca in Chile, then we miss all of the other impacts that are also happening. And so we need to think about place-based issues. We need better responses for them, but we also need to think about global commons. And a number of different people have discussed this in different ways, but the answer seems to be coming always to this idea of distributed networks with some central coordination, or some, not necessarily central, but interacting systems. So Howard Grenville and Lanneman call it adaptive co-management. Ostrom talked about polycentric governance as having local cooperatives that are interacting with each other and coordinating. Escobar talked about coordinated pluriversal organizing, where you have lots of different universes created, but then those people interacting with each other so they can figure out some coordination. And, I'd like to suggest one example of this is Project Drawdown, which is an organization of scientists and others that are wanting to combat climate change. And they go across many, many different disciplines, and they focus on lots of little problems, but they keep going back to the big problem as well, and they look at how all those little problems interact. So if you haven't seen Project Drawdown's website and books and things like that, have a look at that, because some of the ways that they work together to coordinate across all of these different problems are quite interesting. What you can see this as is a set of multiple interacting fields. We've got exchange fields all over the place doing their thing, recognized areas of organizational life. We've got issue fields that are affecting them. Sometimes exchange fields have 2 or more issue fields or affecting them, usually, probably. And often issue fields interact as well. So how could such coordination occur? How could these mutually affecting fields find each other? Who will fund it? How are priorities determined across all of these different areas? And I believe that we haven't seen a lot of research in this area, and I think there's an opportunity to do some more research there. Should we have a field for coordinating across issues? What would that look like? Okay, so we've talked about partnerships, we've talked about power, we've talked about performance, and we've talked about potential. What could orchestrators do? How could networks be put in place? What's an academic to do? What's up for us? So what I would suggest is we can investigate and theorize coordination issues across temporal and spatial scales. So relating back to that, what is that coordination field? How do people coordinate across all those different issue fields, especially as they interact and affect each other? We can recognize and call out market hegemony, power imbalances, and inequities. We can do consciousness raising, so we can supply the logics and arguments to others to allow others to think differently. And we can have more engaged scholarship. So we're not just talking to each other, but we're talking to others out there and trying to make a difference in the world at the same time. What does that look like? I'll just give you an example here of Professor Mark Anner, a colleague at Penn State University. And remember, I told you about the garment manufacturers in Bangladesh in the issue of COVID affecting them because the big brands canceled all their orders. Seriously problematic, and really a survival issue for not only those manufacturers, but their workers as well. And Mark happened to be doing some research with these firms over the years. He runs a center on global workers' rights. And so he started to get phone calls from some of these manufacturers saying, Mark, you got to help us. You got to help us. Things are going wrong here. And so he got all the information and he wrote up a New York Times editorial saying, the big brands are leaving people high and dry despite their commitments. They're, really hurting people in the way that they're acting here. They're creating survival issues for these firms. What can we, and these are the brands. So he had the brands listed that were canceling their contracts. And then he sent that editorial, before he sent it to the New York Times, he sent it to all the big brands and said, do you want to change your mind on those contracts? And a lot of them did. Most of them did. And so they reinstated some of the contracts. They negotiated fairer agreements with their workers. And it's because an academic actually stood up and said, I better do something for the people that I've been working with and collecting data from. And in addition, he does some courses that are open online courses on global workers' rights and decent work in global supply chains, that kind of thing. So I have a dream. I have a dream where organizations serve us instead of demanding that we serve them, where we together means humankind and other kind and not just my little group. I have a dream where distributed networks focus on specific problems and coordinate what they know and what they do. And I have a dream where we together take action to solve our collective problems and work towards thriving. What do you dream of? Thanks very much, and I'd love to hear some questions.
Yes. Thank you so much, Charlene, for your very provoking presentation. Very inspiring. It makes us think about more deeply about this organizational form of partnerships and our role as researchers in studying them. I have been noting quickly some questions in the chat. One was about, do you believe that emotions and power and social and institutional elements actually around and within partnership have been understudied?
Yeah, I do. I think there are a few studies that look at emotions. I think that power is not frequently enough looked at because it's such a massive issue when you think about partnerships. For example, you and Lori and others for this conference did an analysis of the papers that were submitted to the conference, and not all, but many of them did not consider the issue of power in these partnerships as well. And so I think it's kind of natural to listen to the feel-good stories about the partnerships and what they accomplish without thinking about what they didn't accomplish and what's driven out of it. And if you don't consider power, you miss those marginalized voices. So.
And yeah, I think the idea of emotions is really getting a lot of attention now in the chat as well. So you mentioned that we don't study that much of emotions, but are you referring to emotions within partnerships or emotions outside partnerships? So in the field and how we respond to partnerships?
Yeah. I was actually referring to emotions within partnerships, but of course that's an interesting question as well. If you look at social movement studies, they've done a better job at thinking about how emotions can be harnessed to mobilize people to action. And so there's more work in that area. Is that the kind of thing you were thinking about?
Yeah, or I can imagine like when a partnership is being launched, there's a lot of energy in the field, like something's going to change, but then when things happen, how, does the partnership live up to the expectations or not? So how is the interaction between emotions within a partnership and with the emotions in the field?
Yes, yeah. Well, and that brings up another issue as well, where a partnership can quickly start to diverge from the field actors unless they're regularly communicating and interacting with those in the field as well. And I think you saw that with the trade association in the sustainable tourism sector. Sean Buchanan reports on it about the Canadian Mining Industry Association as well, where the industry association becomes a bit of a front runner and pushing the rest of the firms involved who may not actually want to get involved. They may not have the energy to see it. And so it's up to the trade association to actually push them to get involved as well. And on the other hand, maybe you think the partnership is going to solve everything and it doesn't. And then there's this disappointment and yeah.
Okay, and then I think there were questions about orchestration, really interesting ones, because you emphasized a lot that orchestrators can make partnerships not as a place of negotiation, but a place of empowerment, and what role orchestrators can play in it. And there was a question but also about the role of funders, what if the orchestrator is also the funder of the project, the mixing of roles?
Yeah, and that I have heard stories about that where the orchestrator is really kind of powerful in setting the agenda. Even if they aren't necessarily wanting to set the agenda, they might actually get to that point where people expect them to take a leadership role because they are providing the funding. And if not, the orchestrator providing the funding really that funding is such a powerful tool. It kind of influences what happens as a result.
Yeah, so if there are any orchestrators in the audience, I would love to hear how you deal with those tensions in orchestrating your partnerships and creating partnerships as a place of empowerment. I think, let me see, there was another question. Alberto, maybe you can unmute. Was it about legitimacy work?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes?
Yeah, I think more or less you already addressed this question. It was just related to the role of emotions also in legitimation work of this initiative. So when you build more on emotions rather than maybe the traditional pillars of, regulative pillars and normative and cognitive, what can happen over time? But I think you already addressed, because then maybe you face some challenges over time and you realize that some people are behaving, ceremonially, and emotion can play like a reinforcing role of legitimation work, or rather over time they can be something that makes more difficult to maintain legitimacy because was mainly built on emotion rather than something more maybe, embedded.
Yeah, but it can also be used to sell really hard, right? You can use emotions to actually, get people excited about the moral value of the project. So if people can be committed to the moral value of what's happening, and hopefully they got into the partnership for a reason. Hopefully there's some positive reason for that. Then you might be able to build up that moral emotion, and then they might feel good enough about it to stay involved, maybe get some social emotions out of it as well. So it can potentially help to mobilize people as well.
But I think emotions, even if it's negative, it can be, constructive in moving forward as well. So it would be an interesting question to see to what extent are emotions hampering processes or facilitating processes.
Sounds like a great research question.
And then there was a question in the audience: why do some partnerships work and why others are not working so well? So maybe you can highlight some key factors that you identify.
Yeah. Well, and I think I'll go back to what I talked about in terms of emotions. Are they listening to each other, or are they just trying to advance their own agenda? And so I think the process of the partnership can actually influence that significantly. If you have a good orchestrator with a good process, they might in fact be able to get people off their own agenda for a while to get them to listen to others so they can start to understand. And I think the more you have that joint listening process, like we saw in the Okanagan water governance area, then you start to see people understanding more and starting to think in terms of us as a group instead of this group versus this group versus this group versus this group. Did I answer the question?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay,
you did.
Good.
Then, one other question is that you refer to partnerships happening in the global space and partnerships happening at the local space, and that they need to be embedded. But how do you see the linkages between global partnerships and local partnerships, and how could we study that?
Yeah, that's it. It honestly is, to me, it's kind of a blank canvas at this point. There hasn't been that much work done on that. We could think about the model of, say, the Forest Stewardship Council, which is, large partnership that has principles overall at the global level, but then also has localized organizations to make sure that they localize forest standards to the conditions on the ground. And then they can take care of different biodiversity issues for different types of forests. They can take care of the social issues, depending on what social issues are involved. And they have the stakeholders at different levels. And then feed it back in, right? If they can take the different local areas and say, oh, we tried this and it worked, and feed it back through the global organization and get it out there, that can really help. I work with an organization, a partner organization. Luciano Barron Cruz is my partner on that, and Angelique Slade-Chance and Desiree Pacheco. And this partner organization is Développement International Desjardins. So it's owned by a cooperative bank, but it's a development organization. They go into multiple countries and set up partnerships to work on inclusive finance. So they try to get money into the hands of people who need it in order to establish businesses. And then they try to build up the skills of entrepreneurs so that they can do well in those local areas and alleviate poverty. And they have, I think, a fabulous process of ensuring that every time they go into a new location, they're contextualizing. They're doing that contextual bridging I talked about with the Bangladesh dairy intervention. They're understanding it really well. They're working very closely with the local partners. And not only that, they're taking that information back to the organizational level, but also to all the partners. So they have conferences where they get people together. They pay for exchanges. So somebody from Lithuania can go work with somebody from Suriname or whatever, right? They can make these things happen. And then in addition, they have a ProxFin, they call it ProxFin network, where it's a repository of all the best solutions out there and resources and things that people can use, and anybody can add to it and anybody can take from it. And if you worked with Day 50 years ago, you can still access that today. So
that sounds like a great best practice for orchestrators to learn from.
Yeah, exactly.
In that sense.
Yeah.
So there's some time for questions. If there's anybody who wants to ask a question, then you can unmute now. Oh, Ithaca, yes, you have a question?
Yes, hi Jacomijn, hi Charlene. Thanks very much for your presentation. Yeah, I asked a question in the chat, but I don't think Jacomijn saw it yet. I was wondering what your perspective is, Charlene, on the exit of orchestrators in partnerships. Is there some moment that they can step back and the partnership will move forward on its own, or will orchestrator exits eventually lead to the dissolution of the partnership?
It's a really, really good point. And I think we're starting to see a little bit more study of exits, but it's clearly an important area for future research as well. If I go back to that Day example, they regularly exit, but they have a process by which they devolve power to the local partners over a 5-year time frame. So in the first year, they're building the capacity of the local partners. They're providing them with lots of information and support. They're there for consultation the whole time, and they step back a little bit more each year. And so they're working really hard to embed it in the local context. And to me, that's a best practice as well. I'm not sure, it is a typical problem with aid or development where anytime you do an intervention, unless you're contextualizing it really well, unless you're having local actors do things themselves, it won't last. And so I think that's a best practice you want to think about, is making sure it's the local actors who are doing things themselves, even if you have to work to build capacity at the beginning.
Okay, there's one question from Ralph. Maybe, yeah.
Yeah, thanks so much, and thanks so much for a great talk. Much appreciated. I just wanted to connect the two slides. I mean, you had the work, you gave an overview of the role of orchestrators, and then you had a slide on the role of researchers, or IES. And I wonder if you have any experience or insight on us as researchers actually being the orchestrators. Yeah.
Wants to come up and talk about this, actually, because Lori has certainly done this as well. And it's certainly something I have not personally done, but maybe Jacomijn wants to talk about it.
Well, yeah. Well, I think like I think it's a difficult position sometimes as being a researcher and you're launching partnerships, but we're observing partnerships, but then you're very much engaged in the process as well. And then it's really about, sharing your insights with the former orchestrator at some point, or So yeah, this is a good question. Like, what role do we as researchers play in this whole process, and how do we contribute to make partnerships meaningful and impactful? So actually, we've been talking about that yesterday very much. Like, what is your position as researchers?
And can I steal your story, Lori, and tell it? Yeah. So Lori was saying that she actually created the partnership with a big grant, and she wanted to see people working together on circular economy stuff, and she was trying to foster the connections, and then she was sitting back to see what would happen. But people kept coming to her to saying, well, what should we do next? Or is this okay? Is this okay? And she was thinking, well, why are they coming to me? And then she realized it's because she had the money. And this is where we started to talk about, funders actually are really important, and they have a lot of power in this process. And so we need to explicitly take that into account.
Yeah. And then I think there was a question from Peter Groenewegen.
Hi, Peter.
No, I was just reflecting on your remark with regard to the lack of connection between the say international or macro level and the local. I think one of the missing links in research in the area is comparative research of national institutional differences. You left out, of course, as necessary, a lot of other ways of looking at the, say, field-field interactions, but state fields or national domains are very important. And there are some studies on, for instance, EU regulation and international actions. And it seems that perhaps because of a North American bias, state and national influences and differences is sort of missing out in the field a little bit too much. I know it's very complicated, but it's missing out too much.
Agree, and I think I've heard you talk about this in person several times, or we've talked about it together several times, and you're absolutely right. We have to understand the differences in the context, the national differences, and a lot of those are embedded in the state institutions, or the lack of state institutions, or the corruption in states, or whatever situation that you find yourself in. That has to be taken into account in comparing notes across partnerships as well. Yeah. Oh, you're muted, Peter.
Remark, perhaps if you look at discussions on societal level theories, I find it frustrating, but sometimes rewarding to look at the work of Castells, who looks at the global power structures influenced by global processes around media and what you have, which seems to be a bit less optimistic than your own story, but might be helpful sometimes.
I didn't think I was optimistic. But yeah, it's Castells is something that Barbara Gray and colleagues draw on as well, and probably we'll hear Barbara talk about that work this afternoon, and power being such an important issue. I want to go back to the day story, because a big part of what they do in order to understand what's going on, or what knowledge they can glean from this, is what we're calling contextualizing and decontextualizing as a kind of a meta process. So they make sure that their interventions are contextualized for each context, and then they try to draw overarching principles and lessons from them. And when they can compare across 20 contexts, they start to get better understanding of what those overarching lessons are. So they record the lessons, but they can't go then apply them directly to the next context, because they have to pay attention to the state environment and the social environment and what the norms are, and things like that as well.
Okay, I have a question also from Kennedy, who is asking about the role of multinational companies. And he asked, well, how can we establish win-win partnerships with local communities? What's in emerging economies like Zambia?
Yeah.
So what role do multinationals play in this process?
Well, I mean, considering they're probably the biggest partners and the ones doing most of the damage and having the possibility to do most of the good, they're really critical partners. How do you get them on side? I think you know, I'm hearing from a lot of people here that it's the same multinationals that are showing up at many of the partnerships. And, you know, if you take a critical view, maybe they're members of that World Council for Sustainable Business trying to push out those logics. And if not, if you take a more generous view, maybe they're just really committed to taking some action. But I think there's a role for some sort of global or transnational governance that says if you're going into a context, you have to at least consult with local actors in the context that you're going into before you can, start whatever it is that you're doing in that context.
Okay, then we have a question from Gian Lorenzo.
Yep. Thanks. Thank you very much. Oh. Okay. Okay, should be better now. Yeah. I was wondering if do you think there is need to integrate research, or there might be potential to integrate research coming from different fields, different research lines, but always looking at collaborative structures. So I was thinking about ecosystems, Alex-based models, and so forth and so on.
Exactly. Yeah, I think it's really helpful. And certainly in our early career workshop yesterday, we saw some of that happening where people came with different perspectives and bringing them in and allowing us to compare across. And we can take it from different disciplines. Peter always talks about bringing in sociological literature that can really help us with some of those cross comparison of different national systems or different approaches. But there are a lot of other kinds of literatures that you can bring in. We also talked about the difficulty of doing cross-disciplinary research yesterday, and how valuable it is to actually do the research together with people from other disciplines, but then sometimes how hard it is to communicate that, and how you might have a strategy that breaks apart that communication a little bit by field, even though the research integrates some of the insights from different fields.
Okay, well, I think that after this exciting talk, we're gonna close the session. We have a short break. We reconvene at 11:30. Meet again in the plenary room in the same Zoom link, and we'll be back in 50 minutes. Thank you so much, Charlene, for being here, and for all of you joining us.